The first time I saw it, I didn't believe it was real. A sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle, locked away in the Louisiana State Archives. A marriage certificate, March 1854, signed in ink that has faded to brown. One name written boldly, Jeremiah Aldrich. The other scrawled beneath it like an afterthought, Celeste. No last name, just listed as property. His cook, his slave, his wife. That paper should never have existed. In a world where reputation was currency, where bloodlines were guarded like vaults, no plantation owner would dare marry his own enslaved servant, unless forced. Unless trapped. What followed that ceremony wasn't love. It was 13 deaths in less than 3 months. Guests, overseers, even kin, buried one after another until whispers filled the parish like fog rising from the Mississippi. Doctors called it nervous fever. Neighbors said bad luck. But some of us knew better. We knew it was revenge, brewed slowly in the kitchen pots of Willowbrook Plantation. Before I tell you how the South's most arrogant planter was brought to his knees by the woman he thought he owned, hit subscribe and comment the state you're listening from. Because what you're about to hear is a story buried for a century. A story polite society pretended never happened. Ask yourself this. If justice came not with a bullet, but with a recipe, would you taste it? I still remember the first time I walked the drive of Willowbrook Plantation. A grand house rose behind the oaks, its columns whitewashed to shine against the swamp air, its windows tall and proud. To any visitor it looked like success, but if you lingered long enough, you could hear the truth. Shutters rattling on rusted hinges, floorboards soft where the rain had crept in. Books on the shelves filled more with dust than with words. Willowbrook was a mask, and Jeremiah Aldrich wore it like a desperate man hiding scars. By 1854, the ledgers told a different story than the painted walls. Cotton profits were shrinking. Creditors were circling. Behind closed doors, he pawned the future to pay for the past, selling off parcels of land, mortgaging tomorrow's harvest, and gambling on nights that ended in bloodshot eyes and empty purses. The other planters whispered that Aldrich was unsteady, but none dared say it loud for fear the rot might spread. Yet in public, Jeremiah stood tall. He greeted churchmen with a polished bow, tipped his hat to ladies on Meeting Street, and signed his name on invitations as though it meant something permanent. He carried himself as if Willowbrook were eternal. But I knew, as did others, that the place was rotting from the inside out. And then came the certificate. The paper I told you about in the hook. It was paraded before the parish as a gesture of Christian charity, a respectable man elevating one of his servants to the dignity of marriage. The neighbors smiled politely, though their eyes burned with confusion. Behind their teeth I heard the whispers, "Has he gone mad? Or has someone forced his hand?" The truth, of course, was uglier. That certificate was no act of charity. It was a collar placed around Aldrich's own neck, a trap disguised as a wedding vow. Even the enslaved at Willowbrook sensed the shift. They watched as their master strutted across the yard, clutching papers and making speeches about faith and benevolence. They knew better. They knew Celeste, thick-set, sharp-eyed, moving silently from kitchen to dining room, with the calm of a woman who had already chosen her battlefield. You could feel the air change in those weeks before the wedding. The house creaked differently, as if it were waiting for something to break. Creditors knocked harder on the door. The fields yielded less cotton, and Aldrich himself began to walk with a tension in his shoulders. A man pretending to carry respect while carrying ruin instead. Neighbors still drank his whiskey and ate at his table, but the laughter in the parlor was strained. They could smell desperation the way hounds smell blood. And though no one would admit it aloud, all of us knew. Willowbrook was living on borrowed time. Willowbrook, St. Charles Parish. Respectable house with rotting beams. Do you think towns know a crime by smell before it has a name? Jeremiah Aldrich did not inherit Willowbrook. He stole his way into it. He came to Louisiana in 1839 with little more than a worn coat and a Kentucky accent that marked him as an outsider. The Creole elite looked down on him, calling him a barn hand with ambitions too big for his boots. But ambition is a dangerous fuel. Aldrich was willing to touch what other men kept their gloves clean from, the trade in human flesh. That's how the Delta Trading Company was born. 3 men bound by desperation. Aldrich, the failed tobacco farmer's son, Marcus Devo, a sugar planter drowning in debt, and Samuel Rochelle, an old sea captain, whose fortune had rotted with yellow fever. Together, they dealt in what polite society pretended not to see: illegal shipments from Cuba, kidnapped free blacks sold back into slavery, and recovered fugitives bought off bounty hunters. For 3 years, their warehouse on the New Orleans waterfront echoed with chains and bargains whispered after midnight. While Creole families spoke of sugar and cotton at their suppers, Aldrich and his partners were trading lives like coins, and the money poured in, dirty, staggering, intoxicating. But greed makes sharp men careless. By 1843, federal marshals were sniffing along the Gulf. Too many questions, too many shipping records out of place. The partners gathered in Aldrich's study at Willowbrook to decide what to do. I imagine the room smelled of pipe smoke and sweat. The walls lined with oil portraits Aldrich had bought to fake a lineage. Marcus Devo wanted out. Rochelle wanted delay. Aldrich wanted it all. That night, he drew a pistol from his coat and shot Devo through the chest. The sailor fought back with a broken bottle, slicing Aldrich's cheek open to the bone. But Aldrich drove a knife up under Rochelle's ribs and twisted until the fight went still. They say a man's true self shows in the instant he chooses murder. For Aldrich, that moment carved itself into his skin. A jagged scar down his left cheek. He claimed it proudly later, spinning tales of a duel with brigands. But those who knew whispered the truth. It was the mark of betrayal. The scene was staged with ruthless care. Money scattered, knives placed, witnesses bought. By morning, the newspapers wrote of a tragic dispute between business partners. Aldrich walked away not as suspect, but survivor. And within weeks he had drained every account, seized every asset, and remade himself into a gentleman planter. But ghosts don't stay buried. Devo's brother Philippe and Rochelle's son Henri knew. They carried ledgers, letters, memories. They carried rage. And while Aldrich walked Willowbrook's galleries pretending at respectability, 2 shadows were already following him, waiting for the moment to make the murderer choke on his own stolen fortune. Aldrich thought himself clever. He thought New Orleans had forgotten, but his fortune was bought with weathered souls, and every coin clinked like a warning bell in the dark. In a city of saints' names, a sinner bought his way into Sunday clothes. If a man builds a fortune from blood, can any church pew make him clean? When people spoke of Celeste, they spoke of her size first. She was a heavy woman, they said. Broad in the hips, thick in the arms, with hands that could knead dough or break a man's jaw. But to reduce her to weight was to miss the truth. Celeste carried something far heavier than flesh. Memory. She had been sold to Aldrich in 1847, brought from Mississippi when her old master's estate failed. She arrived with nothing but a skillet, a head wrap, and eyes that did not blink when men stared too long. She should have come with her husband and 3 children. Instead, Aldrich bought only her. "Why feed 4 when I need 1 cook?" he said, and he sent the rest downriver. Celeste never forgot that day. She never forgave it. She moved into the Willowbrook kitchen as if stepping into a battlefield. Every pot was a drum, every spice jar a weapon waiting for its time. The other enslaved women whispered that she never cried, never broke, never begged. But they saw how her eyes followed Aldrich when he crossed the yard, how her jaw clenched when his laughter filled the halls. She learned his habits like recipes, which wines made him flush red, which dishes eased his aching stomach, which nights he came home reeking of whiskey and perfume, and which mornings he sat brooding over debts at the dining table. For 7 years, Celeste cooked his meals, washed his pans, and swallowed her silence. But inside, she kept a fire banked low, like coals beneath ash waiting for the right wind to blow. And sometimes, that fire cracked through. She salted his soup a little too strong, watched him frown, and smiled when no one noticed. She accidentally dropped his favorite porcelain dish, shattering it across the kitchen floor. She whispered to the others that Willowbrook was sinking, that the master would sell them all when his debts called. Every act was small, deniable. But together they built a rhythm, a steady drumbeat of quiet defiance. Aldrich, of course, dismissed her. To him, Celeste was just the fat cook, reliable, invisible property. He never once guessed that the woman ladling soup into his bowl knew his secrets better than his banker. and hated him more fiercely than any rival planter. But others noticed. Philippe Devaux, Henri Rochelle. They watched her from afar through whispered intermediaries, free black traders who carried messages into the plantation kitchens. And when they learned what Celeste knew, what she had endured, they recognized her not just as a servant, but as a weapon, sharp as any knife, steady as any hand on a trigger. And Celeste? She did not hesitate. When the offer came, she agreed. All she asked in return was one promise: freedom, and the chance to search for her lost children. For years, she had tended her fire alone. Now she had kindling. Now she had wind. Mini recap anchor. A kitchen is a throne when a woman knows what goes in the cup. Audience prompt. Would you carry hatred like an ember if it promised light at the end? Some ghosts do not rattle chains. They rattle paper. In the parlors of New Orleans, beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal, two young men carried ledgers like coffins. Philippe Devaux, the younger brother of Marcus, shot dead in that warehouse. Henri Rochelle, the son of Samuel, cut open under Aldrich's knife. Their fathers' graves were filled, but their vengeance had only just begun. Philippe was the charmer. He could smile his way into gentlemen's clubs, sip brandy beside bankers, and laugh at jokes he found vile. He looked the part of a planter's son, but his eyes were always counting. He measured debts like a tailor measures cloth, never wasting a thread. Henri was quieter, colder. He had studied law and numbers, and he knew that the quickest way to kill a man like Aldrich was not through a pistol, but through interest rates and overdue notices. Where Philippe shook hands, Henri signed papers. Where Philippe spread gossip in the smoking room, Henri slipped accounts into the hands of creditors. Together, they traced Aldrich's empire like hunters following spoor. They mapped the warehouse murders, confirmed the forged signatures, tracked the stolen wealth. They found that Willowbrook was not built on cotton, it was built on lies. But vengeance is patient. They did not storm his gates. They did not shout his name in the courts. Instead, they whispered into the ears of moneylenders, raised interest points by fractions, and arranged poker tables where the cards were stacked against him. And in all of this, one detail mattered most: Celeste. They learned of her through free black traders, men who bought eggs at market and carried whispers back to town. They heard of the cook who never smiled at her master, who salted his stew with quiet contempt, who had been torn from her family and lived with bitterness hotter than her own stove. When Philippe finally arranged for word to reach her, the answer came swiftly. Yes, Celeste would help. She already knew his habits, his weaknesses, his sicknesses. She had been preparing in silence for years, waiting for allies who would turn her fire into a conflagration. So the plan became a braid of 3 strands. Philippe, to stalk Aldrich in the halls of society, learning his pride and his pleasures. Henri, to bleed him through ledgers and loans, tightening the rope with every passing season. Celeste, to watch him in the night, to taste his meals before he did, to know the exact hour his stomach soured and his hands shook. Aldrich thought himself untouchable. But the truth was simple: he was surrounded. His enemies wore the masks of gentlemen, but their weapons were silence. Patience and time in the South is crueler than bullets. 2 sons inherit not land, but proof ink darker than any night river. The law sleeps. Is it a sin to wake justice by other means? There are 2 ways to kill a man in the South. One is quick, steel drawn in the dark, blood pooling on pine floors. The other is slow, bleeding him through debts and rumors until even his neighbors start to sniff the rot. Philippe and Henri chose the slow way. By 1850, Aldrich was already leaning on shaky timber. Willowbrook's profits fell short each harvest. Cotton gins broke down more often than they ran. And still he gambled. Still he poured whiskey into glasses he couldn't pay for. That weakness was the wedge Philippe and Henri hammered again and again. Loans came due. Renewals arrived with higher interest. Promissory notes were quietly purchased by strangers who were, in truth, Henri's own associates at the bank. Aldrich didn't notice at first. He thought fortune still favored him, but month by month the rope tightened. Meanwhile, Philippe played his part with a smile. He nudged Aldrich into poker games where the deck was never clean, into horse races where the outcome had been decided before the gate opened. He made sure Aldrich always almost won, just enough to keep him hooked. A few hands won, a few bottles poured, and suddenly Aldrich was wagering the next season's cotton before it even sprouted in the field. The whispers began soon after. Willowbrook is running thin. Aldrich is overextended. He lost 2,000 at the tables last month. Plantation society thrived on such gossip, and Philippe fed it like grain to chickens. Every whisper made creditors tap their fingers. Every rumor made neighbors hesitate before co-signing a loan. Aldrich's pride turned the knife deeper than any banker. He strutted in public, laughed too loud, ordered extra barrels of brandy he couldn't afford. But behind closed doors he raged. Servants spoke of smashed bottles, sleepless nights, and ledgers covered in his frantic handwriting. Celeste watched all this from the kitchen door. She saw the tremor in his hands, the flush of his cheeks when he lost too much at cards. She knew better than anyone how brittle the man had become. She stirred his stew and thought, not yet. Soon. By 1851, the debts had swollen to nearly $30,000. 30,000. Enough to bury a lesser man outright. But Aldrich clawed and scraped, selling parcels of Willowbrook, cutting corners on food for the enslaved, pawning heirlooms he had purchased to fake a family name. Each sacrifice left him weaker, meaner, more desperate. The parish noticed. And nothing spreads faster than the scent of weakness in the South. Neighbors began turning down invitations. Merchants demanded cash up front. Even church pews grew colder when Aldrich walked in. That is how you break a man without touching him. You make every handshake feel slippery. You make every knock at the door sound like debt collectors. You make him carry ruin in his chest until it beats in time with his own heart. Philippe and Henri had not yet fired their final shot. But already Jeremiah Aldrich was bleeding. His fortune was a mask, and the mask was cracking. Cash runs out first. Dignity limps behind, which breaks quicker, credit or courage. By February of 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich was a man clutching at smoke. Willowbrook's fields were mortgaged twice over. Creditors prowled like wolves. And still he believed he could gamble his way free. That's how he walked into the riverfront warehouse in New Orleans with nearly $8,000 in a leather satchel, money scraped from the sale of enslaved hands, kitchen silver, and the very furniture beneath his roof. The warehouse had been dressed up as a gambling hall, lanterns swinging, tables lined in green felt, dice clattering like bones. Outside, the fog rolled thick off the Mississippi, muffling the world beyond the doors. Inside, the air was sharp with tobacco, sweat, and the stink of men wagering everything. Aldrich sat, smirking, confident. He always did. At first, luck played with him. A few hands won, a few pots pulled in, and his shoulders straightened. He believed Providence had returned. But Providence that night had a dealer's smile, and Henri Rochel's careful handwriting behind the ledgers, because the table was rigged. Every man at it had been placed by Philippe and Henri. The hands dealt, the stakes raised, the losses measured, calculated not to break Aldrich too soon, but to keep him sweating, chasing, desperate. By midnight, more than half his stake was gone. By 2 in the morning, only 3,000 remained. His face was slick with sweat, his hands trembling as he shoved everything forward on a pair of kings. A full house crushed him. The stranger across the table raked in the pot, calm as stone. Aldrich sagged back in his chair. His fortune was gone, his plantation already slipping away, and that's when the shadows stepped forward. Philippe Deveau moved first, face lit by the lantern glow, the scar of resemblance to his murdered brother carved into his cheekbones. "Jeremiah," he said softly, "you look like you've seen a ghost." From the far corner, Henri Rochelle appeared, ledger in hand. "Or 2, he added. Aldrich's breath caught. He knew those names. He had buried those fathers. And now the son stood before him, alive with vengeance. They laid the papers down, forged notes, old ledgers, sworn accounts. Every crime Aldrich thought he erased was there, written in ink that refused to fade. "You can die tonight," Philippe said, his voice low, "and the river will keep your secret." He slid another paper across the table. "A marriage contract, Celeste's name written plain. You can marry your cook, publicly, legally, before God and Louisiana. Live as her husband or die as yourself." Aldrich laughed then, a dry, broken sound. "Impossible," he hissed. "No minister would perform it. No court would honor it." Henri's smile was colder than river fog. The minister's debts already speak louder than his God, and Louisiana law honors signatures, not dignity. Choose. The warehouse fell silent, the dice stilled, the cards cold. Outside, a ship's horn moaned like a funeral bell, and Jeremiah Aldrich, master of Willowbrook, who once thought himself untouchable, sat trembling at a table where his fate had been dealt long before he walked through the door. New Orleans night. One table, 3 men who know the price of breath. Would you choose humiliation over death if both meant chains? March 15th, 1854. The day dawned heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. By evening, wagons rattled up Willowbrook's Drive, carrying neighbors who had come not out of celebration but curiosity. Invitations had been sent in the name of Jeremiah Aldrich, though the words had been drafted by Philippe and Henri. They came dressed in silks and suits, whispering behind fans and gloves. "Surely it's a joke," one woman said. "Some stunt of charity," muttered another. No one wanted to believe the truth, that a white planter, desperate and broken, was about to marry the enslaved woman who cooked his supper. The parlor had been dressed in borrowed flowers, candles flickering in silver holders Aldrich had pawned, and then bought back at twice the price. The minister, pale with debt, cleared his throat as though the words themselves might choke him. And then Celeste entered. She wore a simple gown of faded white, her head held high, her steps steady. The guests saw her size, her dark skin, the strength in her arms. But what struck me most was her composure. She looked at Jeremiah not as property looks at a master, but as a judge looks at a condemned man. Aldrich stood stiff, his finest coat clinging damp to his back with sweat. His smile twitched at the edges, the mask of a man who knew the world was laughing, but had no choice but to keep walking. The vows were spoken. The words were legal, binding, inescapable. To love, honor, and cherish. Aldrich mumbled them, barely audible. Celeste spoke hers clear and firm, each syllable striking like a hammer on iron. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, a shiver ran through the room, and then came the kiss. Aldrich's lips brushed hers like a man pressing his mouth to the barrel of a loaded gun. Celeste steadied him with a hand on his arm, her expression unreadable, but her eyes glittered with something only he could see. Triumph. The guests clapped awkwardly, their faces tight with forced smiles. Some muttered prayers under their breath. Others simply stared, trying to decide if they had just witnessed madness or a new kind of cruelty. By night's end, the wagons rattled away. Neighbors shook their heads, certain that Willowbrook's master had lost both fortune and reason. And inside that great house, the new Mrs. Aldrich began her reign. Celeste did not scream or gloat. She simply moved through the house with a quiet authority, rearranging the furniture, issuing instructions, speaking to Jeremiah as an equal. No, as something greater. He tried to protest once about a rug she moved from the parlor to the hall. She fixed him with a look so sharp he faltered, and she said only, "We are husband and wife now, Jeremiah. Best we act like it." It was the first of many reminders that his crown had been melted down into her shackles, and every day after that wedding, Jeremiah Aldrich lived inside the humiliation he had signed with his own trembling hand. A vow can be a lock. A ring can be a shackle polished bright. If a whole town watches a cruelty and smiles, who is guilty? After the wedding, Willowbrook grew quiet. Too quiet. Neighbors still came for supper, but their laughter was forced, their glances darting sideways whenever Celeste entered the room. Aldrich pretended at cheer, pouring brandy and boasting of cotton yields that no longer existed. But behind the mask he was unraveling, and Celeste, she waited. She worked. She cooked. The kitchen became her battlefield, each pot and pan a weapon, each spice jar a vial of possibility. At first it was subtle, a cup of coffee with a faint bitterness, a stew that left Aldrich's stomach churning long into the night. He dismissed it as stress, indigestion, bad luck. But the truth was darker. Celeste was measuring out vengeance the way she measured flour. Slowly, carefully, a grain at a time. Arsenic was easy enough to find in the South. It lived in rat poison, in powders sold by apothecaries to cure pests. Too much, too fast, and suspicion would rise. But Celeste knew patience. A pinch here, a drop there. until Jeremiah's body betrayed him. He began to complain of dizziness, of headaches, of stomach cramps that doubled him over. His hands shook. His once booming voice cracked into hoarse whispers. The doctor came, peered at him over spectacles, and declared it nervous exhaustion. "Rest, Mr. Aldrich. Eat well, pray." Celeste stood behind the doctor, nodding dutifully, the picture of a devoted wife. Her eyes never left Jeremiah's face. The parish saw only what she allowed them to see. When guests visited, she laid out banquets: roasted duck, sugared fruits, golden cornbread. Jeremiah would touch none of it. His hands hovered over the plates, trembling. The guests whispered that grief had driven him mad, that humiliation had curdled his mind. And when he refused a sip of wine poured by his wife, they pitied her, not him. That was her brilliance. Every act of survival he attempted: locking doors, cooking meals in secret, drinking only from his private well, looked to outsiders like lunacy. They saw not a man under attack, but a husband turning paranoid against a faithful wife, and Celeste never broke character. She sighed when he refused her meals. She wept quietly to neighbors about his declining health. She prayed louder at church, her hands folded tight, her tears shining in the candlelight. Parish women comforted her, calling her long-suffering, faithful, God's own servant. Jeremiah was trapped. He could feel the poison inside him, gnawing at his insides. But if he cried foul, no one would believe him. Who would trust the word of a ruined gambler, a desperate planter, against the soft-spoken testimony of a grieving wife? The walls of Willowbrook pressed in closer each day. Celeste's presence filled every room, her footsteps echoing in his ears, her hands stirring pots that smelled of death and devotion all at once. And all the while, she was patient. The fire she had carried for years burned steady now. Each grain of arsenic was a drumbeat. Each cough from Jeremiah's chest was another note in the song of his undoing. This was not murder. This was orchestration, and Jeremiah Aldrich was the final instrument in Celeste's long, deliberate symphony. Not every blade shines. Some dissolve. If justice could be measured in grains, how many would you pour? By the spring of 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich no longer trusted his own table. He locked himself in the study at night, cooking eggs over a candle flame, drinking only from a well he guarded with a rusted key. He slept in the guest room with the door bolted, pistol loaded beneath his pillow. To his mind, these were the only defenses left. But to the parish, it looked like madness. Neighbors came to visit, curious to see the odd marriage they still whispered about. They found Aldrich gaunt and hollow-eyed, refusing to touch the meals his wife laid out. Celeste would sigh softly, shaking her head. "He won't eat. He won't drink. He thinks I'm trying to harm him." The neighbors' eyes widened, pity blossoming. Not for him, for her. They saw only a devoted wife, patient and long-suffering, enduring the paranoia of a husband cracking under humiliation. The physician, Dr. Warren, scribbled notes in his ledger: nervous collapse, delusions brought on by stress. Each visit he repeated the same advice: "Rest, Jeremiah. Lean on your wife. Trust her care." And Celeste would nod earnestly, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Aldrich tried to protest. He muttered about bitter coffee, about strange powders, about the faint metallic tang he swore he tasted in his bread, but every word branded him further as unstable. "The master's mind is gone," the enslaved whispered. "Grief has undone him," said the neighbors. Meanwhile, Celeste grew only more beloved. Parish ladies praised her devotion, bringing casseroles and cloth as though she were the one in need. She accepted their comfort with bowed head and soft thanks, the perfect portrait of piety. Every defense Aldrich built turned against him. The locked doors, proof of his lunacy. The skipped meals, evidence of his decline. The trembling in his hands, a sign of failing nerves. He was not seen as a man under siege, but as a man unraveling in front of his neighbor's eyes. And Celeste? She kept the rhythm steady. A pinch in his wine, a grain in his coffee. Always just enough to worsen the shakes, deepen the shadows under his eyes, twist his stomach until he doubled over in the night. He became a ghost in his own house. Servants avoided his gaze. Guests whispered behind his back. Even the church pews grew distant. Once he had commanded attention with his boasts and his wealth. Now he was nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in parlors. "Did you hear? Aldrich has lost his mind. Poor Celeste must suffer it. The humiliation was almost worse than the sickness. He could feel the walls of Willowbrook closing in, the laughter of society sharpening into knives. And through it all, Celeste moved like a shadow, never hurried, never cruel in public, always playing her role. That was her genius. She did not need to kill him quickly. She only needed to let him live long enough for the parish to believe he was already dead inside. By May, Jeremiah Aldrich was no longer feared, no longer respected. He was pitied. And in the South, pity is just another kind of grave. When a lie wears a widow's dress, men rush to hold her hand. Do crowds cure truth or crush it? The invitation read simple enough. An evening supper 3 months to the day of our union. Neighbors thought it odd, even grotesque, that Aldrich would celebrate such a marriage. But curiosity always outweighs decency in the South. By sundown, 12 guests filed into Willowbrook's dining room, 12 chairs polished and set, crystal glasses glimmering in candlelight, and at the head of the table sat Jeremiah, pale and trembling, pretending still to be master of his house. The 13th chair was his. The unlucky seat. Celeste moved among the guests with grace, laying platters of roast duck, candied yams, cornbread golden at the edges. She poured wine into each glass with deliberate care. Only one bottle had been chosen for this night. Drawn from the cellar, dust brushed away, its cork cracked in full view of everyone. That was the brilliance of it. No one could claim the wine had been tampered with. It was opened before their eyes, poured openly, blessed with a toast. 3 months, Celeste said, raising her glass, her voice calm, warm. May the Lord bless our union, and grant us many more years together. The guest smiled uneasily, clinking crystal. Aldrich's hand shook as he lifted his glass. He knew, God help him, he knew. But to refuse, in front of neighbors already convinced of his madness, would mark him as raving beyond repair. He drank. Minutes later, the color drained from his face. His chest clenched. His hand clawed at his throat. He doubled over with a gasp, his chair scraping across the wooden floor as he collapsed into the 13th seat. The room erupted. Ladies shrieked, men shouted for water. Dr. Warren rushed forward, fumbling with his bag, muttering about apoplexy. And through it all, Celeste fell to her knees beside her husband, weeping, clutching him to her breast. Save him, doctor. Please, save him. The neighbors saw only a grieving wife begging for mercy. None saw the flicker in her eyes when she bent close to Jeremiah's ear. None heard the whisper only he could catch over the din. Marcus Devo was my blood. Samuel Rochelle was my kin. I've been waiting since 1845 to watch you die. Aldrich's eyes bulged with horror, his lips trembling, but no sound came. The poison was already working its way through his veins, burning his chest, suffocating his breath. The dinner guests crowded around Celeste, comforting her, praising her devotion, telling her she was strong. They didn't notice how carefully she kept her body between Jeremiah and the doctor, blocking every attempt at aid. By 9:47 p.m., Jeremiah Aldrich was dead. Officially, the doctor wrote, natural causes brought on by nervous collapse. Unofficially, everyone nodded and said, poor man, he finally broke. But those of us who knew, those who had seen the ledgers, the scars, the lies, and we understood. The 13th chair at Willowbrook had been waiting for him all along, and Celeste had poured his last cup with steady hands. 13 chairs, one secret, poured, lifted, swallowed. If you heard a confession meant for only one man's ear, would you speak or keep the world asleep? The day Jeremiah Aldrich was buried, the sun refused to shine. Gray clouds hung over St. Charles Parish as neighbors gathered at the family plot, whispering among themselves. They shook their heads, saying the master of Willowbrook had worked himself into an early grave. They patted Celeste's arm, offering comfort, praising her for standing strong through the ordeal of her poor husband's decline. No one saw the truth, that the widow in black was not mourning, but watching her freedom take root in the soil above his coffin. The records tell a simple story. Jeremiah Aldrich, age 41, dead of natural causes associated with exhaustion. Widow Celeste Aldrich, heir to Willowbrook Plantation, inheriting all holdings and debts. Within weeks, she signed papers transferring the estate to representatives of financial institutions. In truth, Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle, who now held the keys to everything Aldrich once claimed as his own. And then Celeste vanished. Some said she went north, papers in her pocket, a small fortune in her purse. Others whispered she slipped into Canada with conductors on the Underground Railroad, still searching for the children ripped from her arms years before. The parish clucked their tongues, calling it strange, but no one pressed further. A widow leaving was not unusual. What became of Willowbrook, though? That was unusual. Philippe and Henri didn't sell it for profit. They transformed it. The grand house, once a monument to blood money, became a station on the Underground Railroad. Lanterns burned in attic windows as signals. Bread was left at the back door for those fleeing through the swamps. Hidden rooms in the cellar sheltered runaways until safe passage north could be arranged. The irony was bitter and perfect. Aldrich's house, the stage of his cruelty, now became a sanctuary against the very system he had helped to feed. His wealth, stolen through betrayal and blood, was redirected to smuggle men, women, and children out of bondage. The parish, blind to the truth, still spoke of Willowbrook with unease. Strange things happen there, they muttered. The new owners don't invite company. They never guessed that freedom was walking through those halls, that whispered maps were drawn in candlelight at the very table where Aldrich had once boasted of his fortunes. Philippe and Henri had completed their revenge, not just by killing Aldrich, but by erasing him. His name sank like a stone in muddy water. No heirs, no legacy, no lineage. The house that once carried his pride became a weapon against everything he stood for. And in the South, to be forgotten is the cruelest death of all. The house that fed whip hands now feeds footsteps. Does history remember truth or just what power lets survive? The marriage certificate still exists, brittle, yellowed, tucked away in a drawer of the Louisiana State Archives. Jeremiah Aldrich, Celeste. A planter and his cook bound not by love but by a contract signed under duress, under shadow, under threat. To most who glance at it, it is nothing more than a curiosity, a footnote in a forgotten ledger. But to those who know, it is the gravestone of a man who thought himself untouchable. That paper was his noose. Celeste's kitchen was the courtroom. Her ladle, the gavel. Each grain of powder, each bitter sip of coffee. A sentence handed down with patience greater than any judge could muster. She did not shout. She did not strike. She waited. And in waiting, she proved that justice can be silent and still deafening. Philippe and Henri carried their father's names like weapons. They used ledgers, contracts, and debts in place of pistols, and when the time came, they did not simply kill Aldrich. They unmade him. His plantation, once a fortress of pride, became a lantern house for runaways slipping through swamps toward freedom. His legacy, once written in stolen wealth, was erased line by line until even the parish forgot. The South is littered with graves of men like Aldrich, planters who thought themselves gods, only to be revealed as desperate, frightened men when the masks cracked. Most of them are remembered in marble, their sins scrubbed clean by time. But Jeremiah Aldrich? He was given no monument, no heirs, no elegy but this, and perhaps that is the truest punishment. To be swallowed by history, to become a story whispered in kitchens, not a name carved in stone. So if you ever stand in the archives and see that marriage certificate, remember what it cost. 13 deaths, 11 years of planning, one cook who carried her hatred like a coal until the day she could set the whole house alight. If you're still watching, it means you care about buried history. Subscribe now, and share this story with someone who believes the past was tidy, polite, and clean. It wasn't. It bled. It burned. It whispered through poisoned cups and brittle papers. I leave you with this question. Would you have joined them? Would you have waited patiently for justice to ripen? Or turned the page and left the ink to dry alone? Because sometimes the only monument to the forgotten is the story that refuses to stay buried. One paper, one kitchen, 13 names the parish won't say. Would you have joined them? Or turned the page and left the ink to dry alone?